We've just started renovating our bathroom, and in this video I'll make a vanity. It'll live in this corner over here. I've modelled it on the computer, and the wood I'll be using is a local hardwood. It's Gimpy Messmate, so the first thing I'll do is jump in the car and go and pick that up. It's about an hour away from here, but it's a pretty nice drive. On the way we passed the big kangaroo, so I had to stop and get a snap. We're getting the wood from Darcy at Mooloo Timber. He's already planed the boards down so far, but I'll finish dressing them in my own workshop. Some of you may remember the wood that I used on my kayak build. I got that from Darcy as well. He has all sorts, so if you need any quality timber, check him out. I'll put a link in the description. I'm going through all the boards, picking out the best ones for the drawer fronts, the top and the one side of the cabinet. The other side will be against the wall, so that won't be seen, and then I'll start cutting down the pieces to rough length. This is very dense wood and my jointer only just coped with it, but I managed by taking very light passes. The thicknesser, on the other hand, did an awesome job with its helical cutters, and I love this model as I never get any snipe whatsoever. That's all the boards milled for the cabinet itself, so next I'll glue them together into panels. Next I'll put the panels through the drum sander, and since I've had this machine I seem to be using it on every woodwork project, but this is the first time I've used the open end to sand a wider piece. That worked awesome. Next I'll cut a 45-degree angle on the ends to join the panels with miters. I cut one end on each panel first, then set a stop block and cut the opposite end. I taped them together to take a look at it, and next I'll cut grooves for splines to reinforce the joint, and here's a test piece that I did. I'll cut the grooves with a trim router and a simple jig made from plywood. The first part is a fence with a 45-degree bevel cut on the one edge, and this will be a support for the router base to ride on. Here's the second part of the jig, which will make more sense when I use it. I'll start the cut from the back of the panel, where it doesn't matter if the spline will be seen. I've made a mark to position each panel consistently, and I've also added a stop so that the cut finishes before it goes through the front. I'll cut each groove in 3 passes, lowering the bit each time. You could make a feature of an exposed spline on the front, but it's not what I want on this project. If that's something I did want, I wouldn't need this jig at all, as it will be easy to cut all the way through on the table saw. That worked great. I cut the one end on all the boards first, and then I needed to set up the fence and the stop block to route in from the opposite side for the other end of the boards. I reckon the jig worked awesome, and if you wanted both ends to be hidden, you could still do that, but you'd have to use a plunge router. For the splines I'm using 1/4-inch plywood strips, but before I join the cabinet there's a couple more things to do. First I'll cut a bevel on the front edges just to add a bit of interest. I'll be gluing a plywood back panel into the cabinet, so I'll use a dado stack on the table saw to cut a rebate for it. One last thing to do before assembling is to cut a dado for a central divider, which will be made from plywood. I'm using a 12mm bit in the router for 12mm plywood. That's a bit tight though, so I'll make another cut and I'll use tape on the fence to nudge it over just a touch. I've already cut a piece for the dividing panel. It needs a cutout though, and that's for clearance for the plumbing. To help pull the joints together, I've cut some cauls from plywood, which I'll glue to the outside of each joint, and then I'll be able to clamp across those to pull the joint nice and tight. I knew this wasn't going to be the easiest or quickest glue up, so I'm using Type Bond 3, which will give me more time before the glue starts to set. I was so confident that the cauls would work, and before I glued it I did do a dry fit first, but the tape was slipping and I couldn't get enough pressure on the clamps. The CA glue was fine, it was the tape slipping on the cabinet. Anyway, I had to work fast, so I grabbed ratchet straps and I pulled it together like that. I'm directly gluing the panel into the rebate, and I've cut it just about perfect for the opening for a good fit. I'll leave the straps on while I make the drawers. I'm using 12mm or 1/2 inch marine ply, and I'll start with cutting all the sides. Out of the 6 drawers, 2 of them are the full depth and the other 4 will be shorter to allow for plumbing at the back. To join the sides, I'll use finger joints. It's been a while since I made any, but I always start with marking the top edges and the outside faces, and then I use a marking gauge on the inside faces to avoid any tear out. I cut them 2 at a time, with the outside faces facing in and the top edges always facing towards the key on the jig. This way any tear out will be on an inside face, and because I used the marking gauge I've already dealt with it. It's then an easy operation to make a cut, move that cut over the key, make the next cut, and so on. After cutting the fingers on both ends, I'll cut the opposing joint onto the shorter pieces. I do that by using one of the first pieces with the full finger over the key to set the shorter pieces against, and then I go ahead and cut all the fingers on those pieces. They're all done and just about a perfect fit. Next I'll cut a groove for a bottom panel, which I'll make from 6mm or 1/4 inch plywood. The worst part of making finger joints is gluing them together. What I do is get a decent coverage on one side of the joint, and then the opposite side I just brush them along the edge, letting some of it run into the joint. Next I'll sand the cabinet and drawers when they're dry, and that's ready for finish. I can then fit the drawers. I still need to make the drawer fronts and the legs, but finishing the inside of the cabinet and drawers now means I don't need to take them back out again to finish them later on. For the finish I'm using water-based floor varnish, which should give the cabinet plenty of protection. I sanded between the coats and I lost count how many I actually put on. Next I'll start the drawer fronts. I put these pieces aside at the start of the project and I'll quickly prepare and cut them, which I did mostly off camera. The main thing that I wanted was for the grain on the boards to follow through onto the next drawer front. Next I'll start the interesting part of the project, which is full length sculpted handles. I'll get 3 across this board, and the same as the drawer fronts, I'll follow the grain through onto the next 3. I'll plane one of the edges so I can make an accurate square cut through the middle of the handles. Next I'll route a groove through the underside of the blanks and then round over the corner. I'll remove some of the material first on the table saw. I raised the bit a couple of times, making 3 passes. I was going to use this route a bit to round over the front edge of the handle, but I really don't enjoy starting a cut like this on a corner, so instead I'm making a series of cuts on the table saw and then sand them smooth afterwards. I make the first cut with the handle upright, and with the blade at the same angle of 15 degrees, I make a second cut with the handle lying flat, and then a last cut with the blade at 45 degrees. They're a sort of curve and it'll do for now. Next I'll use a template that I made to mark out the shape and then remove the waste on the bandsaw. I'll attach a template to each handle to finish shaping them, but first I'll add a standoff to it, as I won't be using a router and a pattern following bit as you may have thought. Instead I'll use the belt grinder and a fence that matches the radius of the wheel. The template will follow the fence, and I like this method as you don't get any tear out like I would using a router, especially with this wood. That worked awesome, it did a great job, and it's also pretty quick. By the way, if you're interested, I used a 100 grit belt. After getting them all to the same stage, I round over the fronts just at the ends. I'll use the router bit, but I'll take light passes. I'm just making this up as I go along, taking a bit off here and a bit off there until it looks just about right. Next I'll start refining it by sanding and smoothing it out. Even though I'm smoothing it out, I'm trying to keep a defined edge running all the way through. I reckon they look awesome, so next I'll glue the handles onto the fronts. I put a few coats of varnish on, but after I fit them I'll do a few more. To fit them I use a few spacers and then hot glue just to hold them in position, and then I screw them in from the back. I'm super happy with how that's looking. Next I'll make the last part, which is a base for it to sit on. I've got one board that's thicker than the rest, which will be for the legs, and then the other pieces will be for stretchers. I made a simple jig to cut the legs. It only took a minute or two, and it will make it super easy to cut them. To join the legs and stretchers, I'll cut half lap joints using a dado stack on the table saw. Next I'll mark and cut a shallow half lap onto the stretchers, then I can join the leg sections together. I'll join the two leg sections together with short rails, and I'll keep it simple by using dowels. I don't have a dowel jig, but marking them out accurately should work fine. While making the legs, I kept thinking to myself, are these too short? But I kept going. Now it's sitting on the base, I think it is too short. It does need a basin on the top though, which I'll be making probably in my next video, and that's the reason why I made it lower. I think I'll remake the legs a bit taller, which I'll show in my next installment of the bathroom renovation. I'll also be making a mirror cabinet and a built-in cupboard. I still think it came out fantastic though. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.